Regional leaders called for improved access to Covid-19 vaccines during the 27th Ibero-American Summit of Heads of State and Government this Wednesday. The Cuban capital is preparing for the first stage of mass vaccination against Covid-19 with the domestically produced Abdala and Soberana O2 jabs. The President of Russia has condemned the coup attempts, such as those that occurred in Belarus, Ukraine and Venezuela, during his annual message to the Federal Assembly. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South, and I'm Katrina Goss. This Wednesday, the 27th Ibero-American Summit of Heads of State and Government was held virtually. 22 leaders of Latin America and the Caribbean, together with those of Spain, Portugal and Andorra, came together to agree on common responses to the coronavirus crisis. In the opening plenary, United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said that the world was witnessing growing and unacceptable inequality in access to Covid-19 vaccines. As is ritual in these gatherings, the heads of state advocated for a more caring world to face both the health emergency and climate change, as well as reduce the gap between rich and poor. And United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stressed the impact of Covid-19 on the region in participating in the 27th Ibero-American Summit.
The COVID-19 pandemic is the most severe global crisis the world has faced since the World War II. Its impacts have been devastating for the world and also for the countries of the Ibero-American community. Latin America represents 25% of global fatalities due to COVID-19 and in 2020 suffered an economic contraction of 74% of its domestic product, the biggest since 1821. Countries in the region are at risk of reversing the progress made in recent decades to close development gaps, strengthen democracy and social integration, and promote peace and stability.
The UN Secretary-General also reiterated his concern about global inequality as regards Covid-19 vaccine access.
The impact of the crisis has been particularly devastating for women, children and the most vulnerable sectors of our societies. Today the vaccine launch has generated hope. We have taken important steps in creating the COVAX mechanism, and a growing list of countries are receiving the first vaccine through it. But I am deeply concerned that many low-income countries have not received a single dose, while the richest countries are on their way to vaccinating their entire populations. If this dangerous trend of vaccine nationalism and side deals continues, vaccination in developing countries could take years, further delaying the global recovery.
As part of his speech to the Ibero-American Summit, Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel highlighted the technological and scientific advances in Cuba, which have allowed the country to develop 5 COVID-19 vaccine candidates, 2 of which are in phase 3 clinical trials.
Strong science and technological innovation system, with an advanced and efficient pharmaceutical industry, allied to the universal, free and quality healthcare system, with highly trained human resources, have made possible Cuba's response to the pandemic. A little more than a year after the first cases of COVID-19 were detected in the country, we have 5 vaccine candidates, 2 of them, Soberana O2 and Abdala, in phase 3 clinical trials, and we hope to immunize the entire Cuban population before the end of 2021 with our own vaccines.
Bolivian President Luis Arce called on the World Trade Organization and the World Intellectual Property Organization to work for a prompt modification of intellectual property rights in the face of the need to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines across the globe.
Must be at the service of the human being, without any type of geographical, political or social discrimination, and the access to vaccines must be seen as a human right. For that reason, pharmaceutical companies and governments must maintain sincere cooperation and implement the dissemination of their and technology, so that by working together we can guarantee immediate and timely access to vaccines for the most vulnerable people.
Meanwhile, President of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, committed himself to transmit the ideas and projects approved during the Ibero-American Summit at the next G20 summit.
Series of ideas and agreements that we have expressed in the days leading up to this summit show that our countries can sit at the table of the global agenda with a clear course of sustainable, inclusive and connected development. I commit myself as President of Argentina to transmit this voice in the next G20 summit, and I invite our sister nations to join us in that forum to echo this Ibero-American demand.
Ecuador's parliament this Wednesday began the discussion of a bill seeking to privatise the central bank and the country's financial regulation and policy board. The initiative comes from Lenín Moreno's outgoing government. The proposal, if approved by the Economic Commission of the unicameral parliament, will be submitted to the plenary and will require at least 70 votes for its approval. This is the third time the bill is put before Congress. It was previously rejected on grounds of formalities and constitutional issues. The Andean country's currency is the US dollar. Privatising the central bank and the regulatory board will leave the country entirely in the hands of foreign banks and international financial institutions, as the critics of President Moreno have stressed. The Party for the Democracy of Chile has rejected the government's position and reiterated its commitment to defend the bill on the third withdrawal of 10% of pension funds.
The Piñera president and his government are making a historic mistake. With a very low approval, they turned their backs and closed the door in the face of 90% of the Chileans who are supporting and demanding this third 10% withdrawal. In order to face with dignity the time we have left from the pandemic, we will go to the Constitutional Court with an outstanding constitutional expert of the PPD to defend with teeth and teeth the third 10% retreat.
And Chile's lower house approved a death with dignity bill on Tuesday that would allow euthanasia for terminally ill patients over the age of 18. The initiative, which began to be debated in 2014, was approved by 141 lawmakers. To become law, however, it must pass in the Senate. The bill is intended for people suffering from incurable, irreversible and progressive diseases and with no known treatments. Euthanasia requests by patients will be evaluated by medical councils, for which there will be a regulation as well. Authorities of St. Vincent and the Grenadines announced an initiative to trade surplus vegetables in exchange for water as the country faces the continued eruptions of La Soufre. The Minister of Agriculture said St. Vincent has a surplus of agricultural produce and is prepared to trade vegetables for water supplies with neighbouring Caribbean countries to address the heavy humanitarian impact of the ongoing eruptions at the volcano in northern St. Vincent. The volcano continues to vomit ashes, gas and material, and thousands have been evacuated from its immediate path. In the United States, the killing of a black teenage girl by police sparked new protests in Columbus City, Ohio. The victim, identified as 16-year-old Makia Bryant, was having an argument with another person in front of her house, according to her aunt. The girl was holding a knife, but she dropped it before a police officer shot her 4 times. Bryant was transported to hospital in a critical condition, where she was pronounced dead. The fatal shooting occurred shortly before the verdict against former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was announced, who was found guilty on all counts for the murder of African-American George Floyd. Makia Bryant's death brought dozens of people to the area with messages such as "Enough is enough" and "Black children matter." And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. In Cuba, family doctors' clinics in Havana are making preparations to conduct the first stage of mass vaccination against Covid-19, health authorities announced. The domestically produced Abdala and Soberana O2 jabs will be administered to some 1.7 million people in the Cuban capital. Cuba has produced its own vaccines in a huge scientific and technological effort to avoid dependence on other countries, overcome the restrictions of the US blockade and sanctions, and to provide assistance to developing nations. 2 of the 5 vaccine candidates are in the final stages of the required clinical tests before the rollout of mass vaccination. The extensive network of family doctors' facilities should be ready in the coming days to become the venues for the first stage of mass vaccination against Covid-19 once authorities announce the launch date. The country aims to have inoculated the entire population by the end of the year. Health authorities will recruit medical assistants with 6-year interns and other medical students helping to implement the vaccination campaign. And Cuba reported 1,006 new Covid-19 infections this Wednesday as the daily infection rate stabilizes at around 1,000. Despite the restrictions in place to fight the spread of the virus, Havana remains the Cuban province with the highest number of cases in the country, followed by Matanzas. At the same time, progress is being reported in the clinical trials of the 5 Covid-19 vaccine candidates developed in the country. Despite the increase in cases over the past few months, the infection rate is still low compared to the rest of the region, and the recovery rate is 94.1%. Colombia has recorded a new record for Covid-19 related fatalities in a single day at 429. According to data published by the Ministry of Health, the country detected almost 17,000 new cases in the last 24 hours. With these new figures, Colombia has registered more than 2.6 million confirmed cases, while the death toll due to the virus approaches 70,000. According to data from the Pan American Health Organization, Colombia is the fourth most affected country in the Americas by the Covid-19 pandemic. India registered a world record for coronavirus cases and fatalities this Wednesday. With 2,023 people pronounced dead due to the coronavirus in the last 24 hours and almost 300,000 new cases, the country registered the highest daily rise in the world and the worst so far in the Asian nation. According to the Indian Ministry of Health, today's data pushes the total death toll to more than 182,000 since the start of the pandemic. As the number of cases has continued to rise rapidly in recent weeks, the capital, New Delhi, has been put under a week-long lockdown. "22 COVID-19 patients at a hospital in India died on Wednesday when the oxygen supply to their ventilators was disrupted by a leak. The tragedy comes as the country battles severe shortages of medical supplies during a fierce second wave of coronavirus infections. The 30-minute leak from an oxygen tanker stationed outside the Dr. Zakir Hussain Hospital in Nasik, about 200 kilometers north of Mumbai, cut off supply to the ventilators of more than 60 critically ill patients. Meanwhile, hospitals in India's capital, New Delhi, have come dangerously close to seeing their oxygen supplies run out, as infections continue to spike in the country of 1.3 million. On Wednesday, a French government spokesperson stated that a 10-day quarantine for travellers arriving from India will be imposed to prevent the spread of a worrisome new Covid-19 variant.
Some countries where the health situation is serious and particularly worrying, we are tightening the screws even further. This is why, at the end of last week, drastic measures were put in place and will now be imposed on travelers from Brazil, Chile, Argentina and South Africa. And I would like to announce that this morning we decided in the Defense Council to add India to the list of these countries, according to procedures that will be announced very soon. But of course, the systematization of controls, in particular via antigenic tests on arrival, is being put in place from now on. For the rest, the precise protocol and rules will be announced shortly. Other countries could be added to this list if necessary, and of course we will continue our permanent vigilance.
And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Russian President Vladimir Putin condemned attempts to change governments by force, such as those that occurred in Belarus, Ukraine and Venezuela. In his annual message to the Federal Assembly, the Russian president described as excessive the practice of organizing coups and plans for political assassinations, including of high-ranking officials. At the same time, he expressed concern over the possible number of victims if a coup were to take place in some of these countries. The president also condemned the absence of a Western reaction to the events. Regarding the treatment of Russia by the West, Putin denounced that the unfriendly acts against his country do not cease. He also added that for some countries, the attempts to attack Russia have become a new sport.
You can have any opinion about, for example, the former president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Yanukovych, or the president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, have any point of view about the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, or the practice of organizing coups, plans for political assassinations, including those of high-ranking officials, exceed all limits.
And the Russian president went on to warn that Moscow would continue to give tit-for-tat responses to the coercive measures imposed by Western powers. He also urged the West not to cross the red line with Russia.
In some countries, they have started an obscene custom of blaming Russia for anything, like it was some kind of sport. We behave extremely restrained. We could say without irony, modest. We often do not respond at all, not only for the hostility of action, but also to outright rudeness. If someone takes our good intention as indifference or weakness and is willing to burn or even blow up bridges, he should know that Russia's response will be asymmetric, fast and tough. I hope that no one will think of crossing the red line with Russia, and where this line will be, in every particular case, we will determine it ourselves.
Meanwhile, President Vladimir Putin vowed that Russia, one of the world's major producers of oil and gas, would do its part to fight climate change.
We must respond to the challenges of climate change, adapt agriculture, industry, housing and utilities, the entire infrastructure, and create an industry for the utilization of carbon emissions, achieve a reduction in their volumes and introduce strict control and monitoring.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky requested a meeting with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin to avoid a new war in the Donbas region, where tensions have been escalating since Ukraine started massing troops along the borders with Russia and the two self-proclaimed People's Republics of Lugansk and Donetsk in an apparent attempt to retake the territories. Russia responded in turn with a military build-up. In a televised message, the Ukrainian president said significant progress had been made on Monday and Tuesday in negotiations to resume the ceasefire in the disputed zone, but he blamed Russia for not releasing a joint statement. The mostly Russian-speaking areas of Lugansk and Donetsk declared independence from Ukraine after a Ukrainian nationalist surge following a coup in 2014. A formal truce was agreed in 2015 and again in 2020. The Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons approved on Wednesday a resolution to deprive Syria of its rights and privileges before the body. The resolution alleged that the Syrian government used chemical weapons in the towns of Al-Latamina in March 2017 and Sarakib in February 2018, which both Syria and Russia strongly deny. The draft resolution introduced by France was approved with 87 votes in favour and 15 against, including Russia, and 34 abstentions at the 25th session of the Conference of Member States in The Hague. The Russian representative to the organisation, Alexander Shulgin, criticised the decision. The accusations against Damascus are motivated by a geopolitical plot, he stressed. China on Wednesday criticised Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga for rendering honours to war criminals at a shrine in Tokyo. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin also called on Japan to suspend the plans to release radioactive wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear plant into the Pacific Ocean.
The Yasukuni Shrine warships Class A, war criminals of World War II, were directly responsible for Japan's war of aggression. We always resolutely oppose the erroneous practices of Japanese dignitaries. China urges Japan to adhere to the principles of the 4 political documents of China and Japan, effectively implement the 4-point consensus between the two sides, face up to and deeply reflect on the history of aggression, draw a clear line with militarism, and take practical action to gain the trust of its Asian neighbors and the international community. It has been 10 years since the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident, and it's still bringing continuous harm to the surrounding ecological environment, which shows that the disposal of radioactive nuclear elements is very complex and difficult. At the same time, it also shows that the authenticity of the so-called safe disposal claimed by Japan and unilateral information and data provided by Japan needs attention and verification. Japan should draw a lesson from the past and correct its unilateral wrong decision to release Fukushima nuclear wastewater into the sea, rather than letting people around the world pay for its wrongdoing.
While the world is focusing on the Covid-19 pandemic, malaria keeps killing children in Africa. The World Health Organization has administered over 1.7 million doses of malaria vaccine to some 650,000 children in Ghana, Kenya and Malawi. The number of children cared for indicates strong community demand for the vaccine, the UN Health Agency said. Dr. Catherine O'Brien, director of WHO's Immunisation, Vaccines and Biologics Department, detailed that the cases of Ghana, Kenya and Malawi prove that existing childhood vaccination platforms can effectively save lives. Millions of poor families in Africa don't have access to malaria prevention measures. The vaccine, RTS, is the first and only certified vaccine to fight malaria in children, reducing hospital admissions and the need for blood transfusions. In Chad, the only son of late President Idriss Deby will lead the country's Transitional Military Council, it was announced on Wednesday. In addition to the functions of Chief Magistrate, Mahamat Idriss Deby, who holds the rank of General, will be the Supreme Chief of the Armed Forces, the presidency posted on its website. Chadian President Idriss Deby was reportedly killed in combat by rebels in northern Chad, only days after winning a sixth term in office. His son appointed 14 generals to the ruling military council until new elections take place. No date has yet been announced for the vote. The death of President Deby, who had been in power since 1990, increased uncertainty in this impoverished, landlocked country of Central Africa. In Nigeria, soaring prices are making food and other basic goods unaffordable. Food prices went up 22.9% in March, and general inflation is 18%, a four-year high, the National Bureau of Statistics announced on Wednesday. Customers at a popular market in Lagos explained their struggle with soaring prices.
To the market, just like the way you saw me pricing things, you no longer get them the same way we used to buy again. Even them themselves, they keep complaining, they buy very cost.
You can imagine the sales of some items, the cost of some items as at 2 weeks ago has increased with like 50% increase. We experience that increase almost every day.
And we've come to the end of this news brief, but remember you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss. Thank you for watching.